Okay, good. That's slavery and abolition. Hello, this is an overview of the slavery and abolition lecture. I'm going to be talking today about the peculiar institution, the anti-slavery and abolition movements that grew up in the 1820s, 30s, 40s, 50s, the role of Garrison and Frederick Douglass and other abolitionists at the time, the divisions within the abolition movement, and uh, the splits that occurred as Garrison's radicalism made it difficult to keep the movement unified. So we did all that. Okay, we'll get to the beginning here and just say about slavery as an institution that it is pretty much what you expect it to be. That slavery was given a huge shot in the arm by the invention of the cotton gin in the 1790s. In the decades following that invention, cotton became an important crop and slavery grew up alongside the cotton crop, then spread throughout the South, so that there were 4 million slaves at the outbreak of the Civil War. 1 in 7 Americans belonged to another American. The peculiar institution was 3/4 of white families in the South do not own a slave. You see that it varies according to state. Most heavily enslaved state is South Carolina, and Mississippi and Louisiana, Alabama after that. But as you move further north, slavery is less and less important as a part of the society. So the work, it's common sense. They worked their tails off in the enslaved people. The family of the slaves was very important as they preserved their naming patterns and family patterns within the enslavement, but it was very likely that children were going to be separated from parents through sale, and that's what happened in the 19th century. In the midst of all this, slaves embraced a form of Christianity that emphasized the promised land, the liberation to come. Slave owners wanted their slaves to become Christians, but the slave owners emphasized the obey your rulers kind of theme of Christianity, and that was a difference between slaves and slave owners. The planter class of slave owners dominated the South. The planter was defined as someone that owned more than 20 slaves, and these large slave owners were the dominant class in the South in the antebellum period. So slaves resisted the planters with the mechanisms that they had at their disposal. So as we trace anti-slavery and abolition, we should probably ask ourselves why it emerged in the 18th and 19th centuries. Why, after 3,000 years of being just fine with slavery, did all of a sudden it become a defensible consciousness that anti-slavery was the moral position. There was a new thing. Well, I think the biggest thing that's happening is there's an emerging anti-slavery consciousness that's reflected in religion, in the Enlightenment sense of equality, in a changing and evolving notion of what it means to be a human being. And these notions of equality filtered into the Quakers and other Christian sects who made it a sin to own a slave. There were other signs that the world was changing. The Declaration of Independence proclaimed that all men are created equal, and that made a big difference. As this notion of egalitarianism began to take root, as the Northwest Territory was passed that abolished slavery in those states, and as the Missouri Compromise debates of 1820 and 21 took place in Congress, it highlighted that slavery was a hard to compromise issue, that it was very divisive, and that it threatened to rip apart the Union. Well, 1831, I have down here as a turning point, partially because that was when Garrison began publishing The Liberator, the first newspaper that was dedicated to abolition. It also was the year of Nat Turner's revolt, the biggest revolt of the slaves toward their enslavement. And I have it as a time period when an emerging pro-slavery movement began to take root in the South. No longer was slavery apologized for or made excuses for. Slavery was taught to be a positive good, and that becomes a turning point in the 1830s. Well, the first organization that tried to abolish slavery was the American Colonization Society, which was founded in 1817. They tried to take free blacks and ship them back to Africa, to Liberia, with its capital Monrovia. The colonization movement promised to try to eliminate slavery by getting rid of the ex-slaves. Well, this didn't work at all. It was a pipe dream. It was a promise of liberation, but it failed to depress the numbers of slaves. While it was in existence, that they shipped fewer than 12,000 Americans to Liberia, but the slave population increased to 4 million. So it wasn't working. On the one hand, colonizationists could begin by selling themselves as an anti-slavery organization. But soon it became apparent that the colonizationists in the country were really trying to support slavery, to make it stronger by eliminating the free black population in the country. So that became apparent. By 1831, the man here, the white man that's shown here, William Lloyd Garrison, had articulated his perspective. And his perspective had a number of components. He believed in immediate emancipation. He believed that slave owners should not be compensated. You don't pay a sinner to give up sin. Therefore, you shouldn't pay a slave owner to give up slavery. He thought that colonization itself was a white racist fraud. He turns his back on that. He he says that abolition itself should not work through the churches or through the government. Those two institutions have been in cahoots with the slave owners for 1,600 years, and Garrison doesn't think they'll be an ally going forward. And finally, he believed in racial equality. He believed that blacks and whites were equal. And in that way, he was very radical for his time. Most people just thought he was a crazy person who believed in racial equality. And on July 4th of 1854, he burned a copy of the United States Constitution, saying it should perish as a covenant with the devil. And this was not a very popular thing to do. Even today, if you burned a copy of on the 4th of July of the United States Constitution, you would be considered a pretty radical person. So he formed the American Anti-Slavery Society in 1832. This is the first national organization of abolitionists that worked through local chapters as part of a national movement. It was led by many different people in the free Black community. They made up 75% of Garrison's subscribers in the period of the sale of the Liberator. And he put Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman on the stage, and audiences became familiar with the stories of these ex-slaves for the first time and began to hear about what it was like to be a slave. And Garrison was important in getting these people well known. So as abolition grows, the rights of the free Blacks decline. At first, this might seem ironic that a state like New York or Pennsylvania could pass laws in the 1820s and 30s, making it harder for Blacks to vote in those states. In Pennsylvania, they were not allowed to vote. Many different states passed laws that define Blacks as second-class citizens, not equal to whites. And you read about this in my article on Ohio, that is what happened there. Illinois had a referendum in 1824 where they voted down slavery 55 to 45. But of the 55 that voted against slavery, most of them voted because they wanted to keep Blacks out of the state. So it was a time of intense racism. As the anti-slavery movement began to take root, many white Americans became aware that their own rights were threatened by the slave power conspiracy. There was a gag rule that was passed by Congress that did not allow anti-slavery petitions to enter into the congressional record. Postmasters were empowered to prevent abolitionist literature from being sent through the mail. That was one of the restrictions. At Alton, Illinois, the Reverend Elijah Lovejoy was shot and killed by a white anti-abolitionist mob that was trying to silence Reverend Lovejoy from expressing his abolitionist sentiments. So that there were over 200 different riots that occurred by white Americans in the mid-1830s that were against abolitionists that tried to shut them up and tried to get their message silenced so that the country would not be confronting this divisive issue. So that's what the abolitionists accomplished. They got the white mob to overreact. So there were splits in abolition. As time passed, it was hard for many abolitionists to stay in line with Garrison on the role of the churches and of the government. With churches, they founded Oberlin College as a place where they could train anti-slavery ministers for many years. And this was the first co-educational, biracial college in the country. This is in the 1830s. The Liberty Party entered politics in the 1830s. They began to vote for candidates who were avowedly abolitionist and ran an important candidate in 1844 who got enough votes that he probably threw the election to the Democratic nominee that year. The Grimke sisters, Abby Kelly, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, all of these were women who were active in Garrison's American Anti-Slavery Society, who spoke to men about slavery and made a lot of people mad at them for addressing a mixed audience, which was unheard of at the time. So there were very, very many different voices that came to the fore under the sponsorship of Garrison, but a lot of abolitionists couldn't hang with all that, so they went their own way and formed their own societies. So the legacies are that Garrison in many ways was a failure in that he wanted immediate abolition, and he wanted it done by basically slave owners waking up and realizing that it was immoral to own a human being. But that didn't happen. But the movement itself was a success in the sense that he got the South to overreact. He got the South to conduct policies that defended slavery to the teeth. And by getting the South to leave the Union, to overreact, he brought on the Civil War and did the only thing probably that could have resulted in the end of slavery in the mid-19th century. So Garrison was to some extent a great success as a political figure. Okay, I hope you found that interesting. Thanks.